Get started. We're in Revelation chapter 7, so we'll be making our way through that one. I actually don't have more material than I have class time today. So I'll be going through chapter 8 and verse 1 is what we'll go through today. Glad to have our travelers back. The Holts are back with us, so glad to have them with us after being in Michigan for a while. All right, let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer, and then we'll pick up in chapter 7. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day and all that you give to us. We're thankful for your word that has revealed who you are and your plan, and to make sense of this world and to make sense of our lives and the direction and way that we should live. Father, help us to trust in your word, that it is sufficient, that it equips us for everything, that it is the authority that guides and directs, but also is for our edification and is an outstretch of your love. Help us to take these messages today to be strengthened and encouraged to serve like these servants of old. In your Son's precious name, amen. All right, so we're here in chapter 7, and just to do a little bit of review, we've been obviously working through this letter, and it was written to 7 particular churches, and those were the ones that we began with back there in chapters 2 and 3. And this is a message that is from Jesus, that he is revealing, that he is pictured in chapter 1 as the Son of Man. And then we went into this letter to these 7 churches. And then in 4 and 5, what did we discuss in 4 and 5? Do y'all remember? Yeah, the throne and the sealed book. And so we talked about really this picture of the heavenly throne scene and then of the Lamb. And we have a very different picture of Jesus here compared to what we saw back in chapter 1. And if you remember, we talked about 4 and 5. The reason that this is in this particular place was to show God's sovereignty, to show God's control of the entire affairs. And the importance of that is going to be seen because there's going to be a tribulation that we're going to talk about some today, where people might be wondering, okay, who is in control? Where is God during all the difficulty and the suffering? And so what we then picked up going into chapter 6 is we talked about the book or the scroll that had the 7 seals on it. And we mentioned that this is something that had been sealed in the past, but it was now presently being opened. And we talked about that in chapter 5, that they had the book and John is weeping. He's upset because no one is able to open it. But now the Lion of the tribe of Judah has come, and he's able to do that. And it's pictured then as Jesus being this slain lamb that is fulfilling what the prophets has laid out. But he now has the authority. He is worthy to open these seals. And so what we have then is each of these seals brings about some kind of change or some kind of revelation. And so what have we seen so far? We've gone through 6 of the seals. What are each of the seals that we've talked about? Okay, war and famine. Yeah, and these are all from the Old Testament as well, right? These are images. Again, we've been talking about this throughout this, but one of the things I went back and looked at, and I was talking with my neighbor a little bit about these 4 horsemen. We need to remember these are actually these are workers of God. These are instruments or servants of God that are bringing about change in the world. And when you look at the way Zechariah talks about it back in chapter 1 and chapter 6, it's about preservation of Israel and the work that God is doing with Israel, as well as the judgment that he is bringing on Babylon. So you have those kind of similar images that are pictured here as well. So we have the 4 horsemen here that are showing again God's control of all the events, and yet the state of affairs in the world is going to change because of what is happening with the seal here. Now, what are the other 2 seals that we've talked about? What was the 5th seal? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Do you have more? Right. Yeah. And that's right. And if you remember, one thing that we talked about with the avenging there is this is one thing that, again, there's different viewpoints on this, but that concept of avenging is something that Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 23 and also going into chapter 24. At the end of Matthew 23, he said that basically all of the blood that has been spilled from Abel all the way to Zechariah is going to come on this generation. And so there was an avenging of that. But as he points out, there's going to be more than that. There's going to be more suffering that is going to come about as well that God is going to be in control of. And then what we ended with was the sixth seal, and what happened with the sixth seal? Yeah. And so we talked about that. Again, perhaps that's destruction of Jerusalem. Again, there's a lot of parallels to what Jesus had there. There's different viewpoints on it. But regardless, we're seeing again, Jesus is moving the story forward of judgment. Do you have a comment? Right. Right, right. And I've given you my personal view on this. I think he is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem at this particular point. Later, I believe he's talking about Rome. I don't really fit into a good box on one way or the other on this. But what I think he is describing is remember, this book is about what Daniel had talked about. And Daniel did talk about the judgment and the times of his people in that concept from Daniel chapter 12. Now, what I want us to see is, again, Revelation is not trying to obscure things, even though it's really hard sometimes to kind of pick up the deep imagery. He's trying to reveal things. He's trying to give heaven's perspective on events on earth so that we can then better understand and better know how to live in the moment, okay? And so as you look at what happens here in chapter 7, what we're going to see is you're going to see events that happen on earth in chapter 7, and then you'll see a flip, and then you'll see the events that are happening in heaven. And that's how Revelation really, if you could almost go through and divide the book that way, where you have a section on heaven and a response, or a section on earth, and then a response in heaven. And there's these kind of back and forth throughout the book. So when you look at chapter 7, now we're going to see, we're eventually going to have the seventh seal, but the seventh seal is not down, it's down here at chapter 8 and verse 1. So we're going to eventually be at that point. But we've got more more to go through before we get there. So let's go ahead, if someone would read chapter 7 for us down to chapter 8 and verse 1. That's going to be the text that we'll look at this morning. Go ahead and get 8 verse 1 as well. Okay, I'll just I've revealed my disagreement with the chapter break. I think the chapter break should be at verse 2. Okay, so let's walk through what the text says here. This is one of the ones that is particularly, I guess, a lot of questions on it. So let's walk through it some. All right, so first off, what words or phrases stand out to you as you look through this chapter? Okay, 12,000. Okay. Good. Wind. Okay. 4. Okay. Seal and sealed. Good. White robes. That one's been common. Okay, yeah. That's kind of strange for our kind of thinking, right? Because we know it's a globe. And I think they knew it too, but the whole concept is every direction, right? We still have 4 corners on a compass as well. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay, what else? Dwell among them, okay. That's one of the promises ever since, all the way back from Genesis. Okay, living God. Okay, that one's going to be a really important word going forward. Okay, well, let's walk through it a little bit. What did John see after these things? Okay, now these things is the 6 seals that we just saw, but what did John see? We're just kind of walk through the text, kind of point out a few things here. Okay, now what 4 angels are these? That's true. I will say likely it's the 4 messengers that we just talked about, the 4 horsemen. So anyway, there may be a little disagreement on that, but I think those are the ones that are controlling the events here. Okay, but what are they doing? Yeah, yeah, they're keeping the wind from blowing, right? So have y'all ever heard the whole calm before a storm? Kind of, yeah. So it's kind of that same idea. You'll see it here as well at chapter 8 and verse 1. Okay, one thing that I just want to mention, what is the primary focus? What is John looking at whenever he's seeing this discussion? Where is John, or what's the focus of this text? I guess let me give you 2 options, but then it's so easy. Is it heaven or earth? It's earth. It's earth. Over and over and over and over again. It's earth, it's sea, it's the trees, all of those kind of things. Okay, so then what did John see? What was the next thing that he saw? Oh, not quite. There's one more. One more before that. Okay, a 5th angel that's arising from the sun. And what does he have? Okay, the seal of the living God. Okay, all right. So then he calls out to the angels, don't harm the sea, the earth, the trees, for how long? Okay, now here you go. It's till that 144,000 are sealed. Okay, so he's got the seal, so he's got to go to them and actually seal them. Okay, so that's the picture here. Okay, so what did John hear was the number of the sealed? Okay, the 144,000. Now that's interesting compared to in verse 8, or I'm sorry, in verse 9, what did he see? Okay, so he hears one thing on earth. Then he looks in heaven and he sees something that's related but different. Okay? So keep those in mind as we go forward here. Now, what was the multitude from? Okay, good. And where were they standing? Okay, so earth or heaven? Okay. Okay, just again, we're just kind of focusing on this. All right, what are they clothed in and what do they have? Okay, the white robes is pretty obvious. We'll talk about the palm branches in a minute, but, well, I guess we could go ahead and talk about it. What do you think the palm branches signify? Fine. Okay. I'm following somebody else's plan. We'll talk about that in a second. All right, what do they say? What do they say? This is verse 10. Okay, good. All right, so you've got the angels, the elders, the living creatures. What do they do now? Yeah, they worship God. Okay, so something is happening that's causing them to be prompted to worship like we saw back in 4 and 5. Okay, and then what do they say? Yeah. Yeah, it's actually, if I remember right, it's the same sevenfold statement. It's blessing, glory, wisdom, thanksgiving, honor, power, and might. So it's the seven-word description that is very similar to what we had before. Okay, so then there's a discussion with the elders. So what do the elders say to John? Okay, what was the question? All right. Yeah, you're right. Now, is that our question? That's our question, right? I mean, if we're reading through it, and again, this just goes to what apocalyptic literature does. Is it trying to hide it or make it known? Make it known, right? The questions in the text are to help us see what these are. We just have to follow them carefully, okay? So, John is just basically like we would in that situation. You know, but I don't know. So, the elder says, though, who these people are and where they're coming out of, and what was his answer? Good. Oh, sure. We're over here, so we'll talk about it in just a second. You're right. It is an observation, but I can't answer it because it's not interpretation yet. Okay, so right. So there's something contextually that he has in mind. Something is happening on the earth that these people have come through that they're now coming into heaven. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll discuss more of that here in just a second. All right, what is God going to do for them? And what happens because of His presence as a result of it? Yeah. So there's just a healing that is brought that they're not going to have to experience that suffering anymore. Okay, and why can these things not hurt them anymore? Which is basically connected with what you just said. Yeah, because of where they are, and particularly, it's related to who is there, right? It's not just a location, it's because it's the Lamb that's doing it. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Right, right. And you have kind of an interesting, you talk about the, making things white with blood. You have kind of a similar one here in verse 17 where you've got a lamb that's the shepherd. Isn't that strange? Unless you've read John or you've read some of the other scriptures, you understand contextually. But that's what symbolic literature is, right? It's not meant to obscure it. It's that you just have to know the symbol in order to understand the picture. Otherwise, it can be a bit confusing. Okay, so God is going to wipe away their tears. And then finally, what happened when the Lamb opened the seventh seal? Okay. All right, so there's 30 minutes of silence as a result of it. Okay. So let's talk some about what this text means, because there's all kinds of questions about it. But first off, I just want us to see, is this an encouraging or discouraging text? This should be really, really encouraging for people that go through tribulation, right? I mean, anyway, I don't want us to get so lost in all of the imagery that we miss the overall point, that if you stay with the Lamb through tribulation, everything's going to be great. Forever, okay? All right, so we'll talk about that some more in application. But let's talk about the 144,000. Where are the 144,000? They're on earth, okay? Because remember, where are the angels at? Exactly. So the power is given to them to harm the earth and the sea, and they're told not to harm the earth, the sea, and the trees until the servants are healed. I mean, I know that sounds really obvious, but yet there's popular doctrines today that say the 144,000 are not on earth. Where are they? They're in heaven, and it's the exact opposite of what this text is saying. So the 144,000 are on earth, and then the rest of the multitude is there in heaven. Okay. Now, what is the significance of the 144,000? Let's start with numbers. Okay, what's the numerical significance of the 144,000? Okay, yeah. So 12 is, again, a number that's often used for the 12 tribes, right? So you've got 12 times 12 times 10, right? So 10 is another perfect number. So this is a symbolic number. Let's see. Is it 3 tens? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sure. I got wrong on the math. I had the image right in my head, but I got the math wrong. Yeah, we're in Bible class, not math class. Okay, so there is some numerical significance. And it's a number that connects to the tribes, it connects to the apostles, and it also connects to the idea of completeness. That's the ones we need to have together. Now, let's get into some of the descriptions. Dan, you added a couple of really important details. What were those details in case someone missed it? Yeah, and a lot of good things. They were redeemed from where? The earth, right? They're virgins, and let's see, they were all male. That's the other. Yeah, okay. So when you look at that, first off, does anybody fit in that category today? I mean, the category that he's describing, I mean, it is a very, very, very small percentage of a category, right? Yeah. I mean, nobody in this audience fits into that category. And even among Jews, that would be a very, very slim category. So we then need to ask, okay, what's the symbol that's being referred to? What is he pointing to? What is he describing? So let's talk about that significance then. What is the significance of the 144,000 as a picture? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that I think is really, really important for what the concept of the sealing is. That you have to see the sealing is God saying, I'm going to protect you. But what's interesting about that is not he's saying, you're not going to suffer. That's not what he says. In fact, these people do suffer, and in fact, they're probably going to be killed. But that's not what he's talking about. It's a seal that goes on for eternity. And you're going to see later in Revelation, the beast is going to offer his own seal, which means you don't suffer persecution. You can buy and sell and trade. You're going to, it's very similar to what the Lamb offers. The only problem is you die, and then you have an eternity in hell. What the Lamb offers is suffering in the moment, but then you have eternity with him forever. Okay, that's the contrast. That's the two marks, the two seals that you're going to have later in the book. Now, a couple of other things before we kind of get into some more specifics on this. Did you notice any tribes were missing? Okay, so Dan is missing, but that's not the only one. It's kind of... Yeah, okay, so that y'all caught those. All right, so let's look at that just a little bit. Why do you think that might be important to understand with the picture? What about Dan, for example? Well, and if you remember too, even what his dad said about him in the promises wasn't very good. If you go back to Genesis 49. And so the reason for that is they're perennially unfaithful. And they brought in some of the idolatry in Judges, and they're pictured as one of the worst as a result of that. So I think that's part of it. Also, if you go back and you look, they actually moved from their specific allocated land. So they weren't even really interested in what God had promised with the land and that kind of concept. Now, what do you think about Ephraim? Again, you might get to say, well, Ephraim kind of gets morphed to Joseph, but why is Ephraim not mentioned by name? Mm-hmm. So that was my understanding of it as well. If you go back, Ephraim was the one, if I remember right, I could say this, I could be wrong on this, but I want to say that Jeroboam was from Ephraim. Anyway, it was that tribe though that led them off into Baal worship. And so when you look at the description here, they're cut off as a result of it. Okay, so that's why we've got the tribes mentioned. Now, let's back up for just a minute. Why do you have a census in the first place? That's what this is, right? It's a census. What do you do that for? Do what? No, a census. Oh. Oh. Yeah, okay. So that's a really important image, but that's not the only. I was thinking about another concept of a reason you would do a census. What's another reason you would do it? It's actually done repeatedly through the Old Testament. That's true. I guess that's the main reason for us, but it's to prepare for something, for war. Okay, for war. And when you see it in Numbers, for example, the two main censuses you have in the Bible, what's the reason? We're about to go to war, okay? So I think that's what he's talking about here because it explains a lot of the other things. Now, this may seem kind of strange, but if you go back and you look at the descriptions of the people, who were the people that could go to war? Yeah, males of a certain category. And this may seem really strange, but they had to have particular holiness in the camp because it's holy war. In fact, it was so specific, if you had a man that had a nocturnal emission, he can't go. He's impure, okay? So when you look at what's actually happening here, this is a picture of the host of the Lamb on earth that is about to go and bring war to fight with the beast. Okay? Everybody with me so far? That was a lot of references. We went to a lot of different places. But that's how Revelation is. Once you understand the picture, then you can start to see what's being described here. Because he's not talking about just certain people that, from a specific origin are... that they're Jews, that they've never been married, all of that kind of thing. He's describing the army of the Lamb. Okay, any questions on that? Any comments on that? And if y'all need references to some of that kind of stuff, I'd be glad to give that to you. All right, so there's a war then that is apparently about to happen. So then where is the great multitude located? Let's move down into our next section here. Yeah, they're in heaven. Okay, so they're before the throne and before the Lamb. And what's the number? More than anyone can know. Yeah, more than anybody can know. And what's interesting about that is, I'll just ask you the question. Are these the same people or different people from the 144,000? Okay, well, you go and explain it. Right. Right. Well, and when I think of the 144,000, I think of it more in the terms of like a symbol, right? As much as more than it is a specific number of people. And so it's almost kind of like, okay, they lost one. Well, there's not 139,999. No, it's a figure for the army. And so as they're going through the tribulation, it's the multitudes just keep coming, even though they're being killed, even though they're being killed on the earth. But there's a couple of things I think that help us to understand more of what's going on with 144,000, because a lot of times people think, oh, this is about Israel. And it is about Israel. Like, I don't want to diminish that. But he's showing the way Israel works. It's more than just Israel. It's Israel bringing in the nations, okay? Because you look, here's a multitude that now in contrast, where these are all sons of Israel, now they're from every nation, tribe, people, and language. Okay, so when you look at the church, how is the church described today? In Galatians, for example. Yeah, so we're the Israel of God, and yet his whole point is, Galatians 3, there's neither slave nor free, there's neither Jew nor Greek. Those divisions have abolished, but yet you have this concept where God is faithful to Israel because they're faithful to the Messiah. They're accepting the Messiah. And then you have the rest of the people that anyone that accepts him is in Israel, but then they ultimately are part of this host there in heaven. Okay, now what is the significance then of the palm branches and we'll talk about their robes washed here in just a minute as well. What's the significance of the palm branches? Yeah, victors.
Yeah, like Roman generals, I think about Jesus when he was coming into Jerusalem, with their palm branches. Roman times, Nike, the goddess of victory, generally had a crown, laurel wreath, palm branches.
Oh. Well, there you go. Yeah. So they're basically following in the same train that the Lamb has here. Okay. So then let's talk about what is the Great Tribulation. I guess that's the $1 million question out of this text, but. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So remember, these are concepts that are referred to in other places. Daniel 12 and verse 1 mentions the contents of the scroll, which we've been talking about. This is what we've been kind of working through. Is there's going to be a time of great difficulty on the people of God. He predicted that. Further, when Jesus talks about it in Matthew chapter 24, he makes a reference to Daniel, and he uses the same wording here. In fact, it's the only other place the Great Tribulation is used in the New Testament, is there in Matthew 24. Now, I'll say this, my personal view on this, I don't think it's just limited to the destruction of Jerusalem. I think it's connected. You had a discussion about Jews as well as Rome, both in Daniel and then also even there in Matthew 24, there's some connections there as well. But the overall point, though, is what Byron was laying out. It's easy to kind of think, oh, okay, it's always been suffering, it's always kind of gone on. But the church was in its infancy, and he is rising to try to strike it right then to stop it, because he knows what has happened, and the whole point is that they're not going to be able to do that. All right, then let's talk about the point of these blessings here, and let's talk about that concept about blood making things clean, and these blessings here. How does blood make someone clean or white? Yeah. Yeah, and remember, our righteousness is viewed like as dirty rags, and the concept is the blood is applied to that, to where then we're able to be pure. What'd you say? What do you have, Pete? Okay. And so how did they do this, though? How did they touch the blood? Yeah. That's baptism, right? That's the means of that victory that is being brought out. And so what we see is these are relief from the sufferings of those people that are on earth, and then ultimately you'll notice the same figures are used when he describes the new heavens, new earth there at the end of the book. So it's a present relief that's ultimately going to culminate in an ultimate belief. All right, relief rather. Okay, so let's talk about how we live this text. What is the mission of the 144,000 on earth? To fight. To fight. Yeah.
So we're sealed by God. Going as far as
Yeah, so if we look at this figure then, who is the 144,000? Yeah, I mean, we look at it as the first century, and I think that's true. But the whole concept is this is an ongoing figure, I believe, to describe the church. That's us. We are the army of the Lamb on the earth. And there's a mission that is given. I mean, why would you have Ephesians 6 about spiritual warfare? Same concept, right? And it's used in a lot of different areas like that. So how are they to wage war in their day, and how are we to do it? Yeah, and you even have a description in Revelation 12. They overcame by the blood of the Lamb, the word of their testimony, and not loving their lives even. Now, if we're not hitting all three of those categories, we've got a problem. And I think probably in our world, our reality is maybe we don't do so well on the word of our testimony and on loving our lives even to the point of death. And yet what we see here is this is our mission. And so this is our threefold work, okay? To be emphasizing the blood of the Lamb, the word of the testimony, and then living lives that are completely dedicated to Him. Now, what's interesting is that's a high price to pay, isn't it? I mean, these people paid the ultimate price. They died. So then let's talk about the other application out of this. If we know this awaits us on the other side of persecution and death, how does that change how we live in the present? Yeah, there's a reason they don't love their lives even to the point of death, right? What else? Sure. Sure. Yeah, so I'll give you one of the things that comes out of this to me. Have you ever heard of we talked about 1 Corinthians, we've been talking about it, the message of the cross, the cruciform lifestyle. You take up your cross and you die daily. I mean, you're saying, I'm going to the cross, I'm dying to the things that I love, and those ideas. That is an upside down way of living. It is not loving your life even to the point of death. Okay? But if we know that this is on the other side, think about what's being said. That allows us to bear witness even when people hate us or slander us or stone us. Because what's the worst they can do? Yeah, is send me to be with the Lord, right? So there is no loss, okay? And if that happens, then we are before the throne and celebrating with the Lord and we never suffer again. And yet, again, the point of contrast we've seen throughout this and we'll continue to see is if we cave, though, we may have security and comfort now, but we will not in the presence of the Lamb. Okay, we'll stop right there. And Byron is going to be back to teaching his class next week. So, and we'll continue there in chapter 8.